The second characteristic of existence is Dukkhata. In our last talk, we explained that dukkha means both felt pain and suffering, and also the general unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence. And here the general characteristic of unsatisfactoriness is intended as the meaning of Dukkhata. But the two are totally separate. A fundamental reason why existence is unsatisfactory is because it is connected with pain, subject to suffering. The pain and suffering to a great extent are rooted in impermanence. We crave for a world where everything that we value and love will remain forever, but it has to change. And when we meet this change, then we undergo suffering. The five aggregates themselves are impermanent. We would like to preserve them, to make them steady, to dominate them with our will, but they escape our grasp, and then we meet with dissatisfaction, with suffering. Our inability to control the very things that we take to be ourself. The Visuddhimagga, the great commentary, says that dukkha has the meaning of oppression by rise and fall. Rise and fall is the feature of impermanence. The five aggregates are subject to constant rise and fall. And when we contrast this rise and fall with our desire for peace, for stability, then the rise and fall of the process seems oppressive. Therefore, oppressiveness by rise and fall is the distinguishing feature of dukkha. Since we discussed the characteristic of dukkha in full detail in the last talk, we'll just treat it very briefly here. Now, the third characteristic of existence is anatta, selflessness or non-self. And this is the deepest, most difficult of the three characteristics. So we'll give it more attention than the others. Now, in the teaching on anatta, the Buddha proclaims that there is nothing that we can identify as self, that all the things that we take to be ourself, to be I and mine, that all of these are really not self. This teaching on anatta cuts very sharply against our ingrained patterns of thinking. Almost all of our thoughts, all our activities, all our concerns center around the ideas of I, mine, myself. Yet the Buddha holds that these notions are deceptive, delusions that lead us into trouble, conflict, and suffering. And he teaches further that in order to get free from dukkha in all of its forms, we have to break out of the clinging to the idea of self. And the only way to do that is to penetrate the mark of selflessness, anatta, to see with insight the selfless nature of all phenomena. The teaching on anatta can easily be misunderstood. To see the exact meaning of the teaching, we have to discriminate between what the teaching denies and what it doesn't deny. We can approach this discrimination by distinguishing the different meanings of the word self. The word anatta means literally not self. So what is the self that's denied in the teaching of anatta? The word self can be used in three senses. Firstly, it can be used with a reflexive meaning, as when we speak of myself, yourself, oneself. And the Buddha accepts this use of the word self. He says you have to train yourself, one must purify oneself, you have to make the effort yourself, and so on. That's a perfectly legitimate use of the word self. A second use is to refer to one's own person, to refer to the compound of body and mind. Here the word self or I is a shorthand device. It's used to refer easily and economically to what is really a complex process. And this sense of the word self is also acceptable in Buddhism. We use it to distinguish different people. The third sense of self is that of a substantial ego entity, a lasting subject existing at the core of the psychophysical personality. And it is with the idea of selfhood in this sense that the Buddha's teaching is concerned. The reason is that it is this assumption of an ego self that gets us trapped in suffering. And now the teaching on anatta doesn't deny the existence of the person, the individual, taken as the psychophysical complex. What it denies is that the person exists as a self, as a lasting, simple ego entity. The person exists, but the person is anatta, not self, not ego. The person or the individual is a complex of the five aggregates. And to say that the person exists is to say that this unified composite of the five aggregates exists. To say that the person is anatta, without self, without ego, is to say that the five aggregates cannot be identified as a self and do not contain a self. That no inner nucleus of selfhood can be found within or behind the personality made up of the five aggregates. The teaching of anatta is the most radical doctrine of the Buddha, the doctrine which cuts across all our habits of thinking and conceiving. For we usually see ourselves to be a self. We identify the body and mind as a self, or believe that we have a self standing behind them in some mysterious way. This is taken to be so obvious as to be beyond dispute. Yet the Buddha holds that the seeming presence of a self is an illusion, a mirage. When we look carefully, we find not a self, but only five aggregates, which are insubstantial without a self. Perhaps we can make the point clearer with an example. Suppose we're walking down a country road at night. We look down on the ground and suddenly we see a snake. We become frightened. Then we turn our flashlights on it, we look again, and we see there's only a rope, no snake. So we say that there's no snake there, there was only a rope that appeared as a snake. The rope was there all along, never a snake. But the rope appeared to us to be a snake. It appeared as a snake because our sight was obscured by the darkness, because we didn't focus our light on it. As a result of seeing the snake, we became filled with fear and worry. We found out it was only a rope. The appearance of the snake dissolved. We saw the rope, and then our fears dissolved. We became very happy and joyful. We felt relief. Now we can compare the rope to the personality, the complex of the five aggregates. We can compare the snake to the idea of a self or ego. Because of our ignorance, we don't see the five aggregates as they are, as simply five aggregates, but we see them as a self, as a substantial ego. And as long as we lack direct insights, wisdom, we go on taking the aggregates to be self, and we evaluate all our experience from that perspective, from the standpoint of ego clinging. But when we develop wisdom, we can apply that wisdom to our personality, the way we apply the flashlight to the rope. And then we see the person as being just the complex of the aggregates, without being a self, without containing a self. To make the teaching of anatta clearer, we have to investigate two things more carefully. First, what exactly is the nature of selfhood? What does the notion of being a self involve? And secondly, why is the person not a self? What are the reasons for negating selfhood in the five aggregates? We'll take each question in turn. First, we want to see what the idea of self involves. If we examine our ingrained notion of selfhood, what we unconsciously assume when we take ourselves to be a self, I think we'll find that it involves four ideas. These might be called the criteria of selfhood. There might be other ideas lying implicit, but these seem to be the four ideas that are dominant, at least that I've discovered. First, there's the idea of duration or lastingness. We think that the self has to be some kind of entity which endures, which persists through time. It might be a temporary kind of duration. If we hold, for example, that our self came into existence at birth, continues as the same self throughout life, and then is finally annihilated at death. Or else it might be a permanent type of duration. When we think of the self as something that comes into being perhaps at birth, maybe even exists before birth, it continues as the same self throughout life, and then it survives forever into the future. That is, we have the idea of a permanent, everlasting, and eternal self. So this is first the notion of duration or lastingness. The second idea involved in the notion of selfhood is that of simplicity. By this we mean that the self is conceived to be an incomposite entity, something which is not compounded, not analyzable into parts, something that possesses a basic simplicity or indivisibility. The third idea implicit in the notion of selfhood is being unconditioned. We think that the self must possess its own power of being. It must be self-sufficient, unconditioned, not dependent entirely upon causes and conditions. If something exists through conditions, if it is entirely dependent on conditions, then we can't identify with it. It doesn't seem to be us, but to belong to the conditions which sustain it. So the self is conceived of as being a self-sufficient or unconditioned entity. Then the fourth idea involved in the notion of selfhood is that of being susceptible to our control. In Pali, this is vasavakita, being susceptible to control. What this means is this. If something really belongs to us in our essence, if we consist in this, then if it can be identified as ourself, then we should be able to exercise mastery over it, to control it, so that whatever we determine it should be, it would follow our determination. There would never be any conflict between what we want our self to be and what it becomes. The thing that's taken to belong to us, to be ourself, would always conform to our notion of what it should be. Would be able to control it, to exercise mastery over it. So these are the four basic notions that enter into the concept of a self. The notions of permanence, of simplicity, of unconditionedness, and of being susceptible to our control. And now we should examine our personalities, the five aggregates, in the light of these ideas. Ordinarily, we don't do this. We simply assume that we have a self. We don't bother to investigate the idea of self close up. We don't try to give the idea any substance. And thus the idea of self remains as a kind of specter, a phantom lurking behind our experience and our actions, something very vague and undefined. But for a thinker, for one seeking truth, this ambiguous view of self isn't sufficient. If there is a self, we have to try to pin it down, to define it, to find what it is. And when we try to conceive a self, to give it some content, it has to be conceived in relation to what is directly experienced. That is the body and mind, the five aggregates. If the idea of self is to have any meaning, any content, it has to be set in relation to the body, the feelings, the perceptions, the formations of mind and consciousness. Without positing any relation between the two, then it becomes just a word, a completely empty notion. Now, when we try to posit the self in relation to the five aggregates, a number of relations are possible, but these can all be reduced to two, either identity or difference. That is, when we conceive ourselves to be a self, we must do so either by identifying the self with some aspect of the body-mind complex, or else by distinguishing the self from the body-mind complex. In the second case, the self is seen as distinct from the five aggregates of body and mind, either inside the body and mind, behind them, or their invisible owner. Now let's examine each of these two positions in turn, starting with the first one, the position which asserts identity between the self and the aggregates, which regards the aggregates as the self. Then we'll deal later with the other position. Now we can show that the aggregates are not self by viewing them in the light of the four ideas we just laid down as implied by the concept of self: permanence, simplicity, unconditionedness, and being subject to control. First, the self is taken to be a lasting, enduring entity. But the five aggregates, as we saw, are all impermanent. The bodily form is a mass of vibrations, a current of material groups, always arising and passing away. The mind also is a series of momentary occasions of awareness, feeling, perceiving, willing, and being conscious, also constantly arising and passing away. And there's no one behind the mental process watching it, a subject, an observer. There are just these momentary mental acts, the thoughts themselves of the thinkers. Usually we incline to identify the mind as self rather than the body, since the mind is conscious, and we think of the self as conscious. But the Buddha says that it's better to consider the body as self rather than the mind. The body at least has some apparent stability. It lasts at least to our awareness for some time. But when we examine the mental process, we see its factors changing even faster than the body. And since the five aggregates are impermanent, subject to rise and fall, they cannot be identified as self. Otherwise, it would follow that the self is arising and passing away. And so our self would become a succession of different selves, hardly the same continuous self that we take ourselves to be. The second aspect of the self-concept is simplicity, indivisibility. But when we examine the individual person, we find a complex whole, a compound of the five aggregates. We find a body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. We don't find anything behind them, anything else. Each aggregate, each of the five aggregates, covers a multiplicity of elements. Usually, under the spell of ignorance, we grasp our experience as a whole. We grasp it as a single mass, and thus it appears to have some kind of solidity, to be a monolithic whole. But when we subject it to precise analysis, we find that the seemingly unified mass breaks down into a multitude of constituent parts. Every experience is just a complex or composite of the five aggregates. So what should we identify with self? The body? The body is a mass of cells, tissues, organs, skin, bones, and so on. So which of these is the self? Feeling, but feeling is of different kinds: pleasant, painful, neutral. Feeling arising through eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind. Perceptions are different. The mental formations are different. Consciousness is always different. So which of these is to be identified as self? Whatever we choose turns out to be impermanent, so it can't be taken to be self. The third aspect of the self concept is the notion of being unconditioned, self-subsistent. But when we examine the five aggregates, we find that they're all conditioned phenomena. They arise through conditions. They don't exist by themselves. The body, with its sense faculties, arises from the sperm and the egg. It arises from father and mother. It gains its being from the bodies of the parents. And the father and mother also, they gain their being from their parents, and so on, back to infinity. So no body exists through itself. Then the body continues to exist through food. It's a flowing metamorphosis of rice, potatoes, vegetables, meat, fruits, sweets, and so on, coming in at one end, flowing out through the other. It's supported by air, water, and sunshine. Then the mental side. The mental process is conditioned by the body. Consciousness doesn't exist by itself, but it exists as a series of states of consciousness. And each of these moments of consciousness arises with some material support, supported by the physical organism. Visual consciousness arises dependent on the eye and on visible forms. Hearing consciousness depends on the ear and on sounds. Touch consciousness or body consciousness depends on the physical body and tangible objects. Even thought consciousness arises depending upon the organ of thinking, the brain, and upon the nervous tissue. Feelings, perceptions, volitions, all these too are conditioned. None of them has an independent existence. And so no aspect of the five aggregates is unconditioned. Then the fourth aspect of the self-concept is being susceptible control to the exercise of mastery. If something is truly our essence, truly ourself, we must be able to bring it under our domination, to exercise mastery over it. We find the five aggregates can't be subjected to our volitional control. We can command them or bend them to our will, since they depend on outer causes and conditions, which are external to ourselves, beyond our control. And therefore, since they depend upon outer conditions, we can't master them. This is the Buddha's argument in the first discourse, in the second discourse that he gave, right after the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. He said to the monks, if the five aggregates were self, they wouldn't lead to affliction, they wouldn't lead to suffering, and we would be able to control them, so we could say, may my body and mind be thus, may they not be thus, may they be the way I want them to be, may they not go contrary to my desires. But we can control the five aggregates in this way. The five aggregates lead to affliction, they lead to suffering, therefore the five aggregates are not self. If the body was truly ours, we'd be able to say, may my body always be young, healthy, beautiful, and immortal. May it not become old, may it not become sick, may it not be ugly, may it not die. If the feelings were ours, we could say, may my feelings always be pleasant, never painful. May my perceptions always be agreeable, never disagreeable. May my volitions always be good and wholesome, never defiled and unwholesome. May my consciousness always be right, be bright and radiant, filled with knowledge and awareness. May it never be dull, defiled, sad, so on. Since we want only happiness and never suffering, If the five aggregates was self, they would always produce happiness for us and never lead to suffering. But again and again, they lead to suffering. We don't have control over them. Therefore, the five aggregates are not self. And that deals with the first position. The aggregates cannot be identified as a self because the self must be lasting, simple, unconditioned, and subject to mastery, whereas the five aggregates are impermanent, compounded, conditioned, and not subject to mastery. Now we take the second position. This position holds that there is a self distinct from the aggregates, contained within them or behind them. But if there does exist a self distinct from the aggregates, we should be able to find it, to point to it, to say, this is myself. But when we try to identify the self, to give the idea some content, whatever we come upon, whatever we grasp hold of, turns out to be one or another of the five aggregates, or some combination of them. Even the mind, which is doing the searching, that is just a group of aggregates. A mind consciousness associated with feelings, perceptions, and volitions. We can't find any self separate and distinct from the aggregates. This is like looking for a pit inside an onion. We open the onion and start looking for the pit. All we find is roll after roll of onion, without any core or pit on the inside. So looking for the self within the compound of mind and body, all we find are aggregates and closing aggregates and closing aggregates. We never hit upon any solid, substantial self. The notion of self turns out to be a void idea, an idea without content. But some people try to interpret Nibbana as a self. They take Nibbana, Nirvana, to be a supreme universal self. But this idea is not acceptable according to the early form of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha says, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta. All dhammas, all actualities are not self. He says all formations are impermanent and all formations are unsatisfactory, but all dharmas are not self. All formations covers only conditioned things, sankharas. Nibbana, the unconditioned, is not a sankhara. Therefore, it's not impermanent and not suffering. On the contrary, it's lasting and stable and the supreme happiness. But Nibbana is a Dhamma, and because it's a Dhamma, in actuality, it can't be identified as a universal or supreme self. To illustrate the selfless nature of the five aggregates, the Buddha gives certain similes. He says that the body is like a lump of foam. A lump of foam seems solid, but when we crush it, it turns out to be just hollow and empty. Feeling is like bubbles, bubbles on water. They just arise and break up and show themselves to be empty. Perception is like a mirage. Mirage appears, but when we examine the object, we don't find anything substantial. Formations, the mental formations, are like the trunk of a banana tree. Just rolls of tissue within rolls and rolls of tissue, without any heartwood inside. And consciousness is like a magical illusion. It appears, but has no substance. So no matter how much we examine them, they just reveal themselves to be empty. Shallow forms without any core or any substance. Fleeting processes. They delude us into grasping an attachment. In the end, they prove disappointing. Now, one problem that's sometimes raised is how the teaching of non-self fits together with the teaching of rebirth. If no self can be found within the body-mind complex, how can rebirth take place? We'll deal with this question more fully in a later talk, the one on karma and rebirth. Here we'll just give a brief answer. The positing of a self isn't needed to guarantee rebirth. In Buddhism, rebirth is understood as occurring through causal continuity. The body-mind process, even in this life, maintains its unity entirely through causal succession, without any lasting self. Each moment of experience is connected with its predecessors and with its successors through a transmission of influence, through a causal succession. So each moment of consciousness receives all the stored up experience that occurred previously in the continuum, the whole storage of memories, habits, tendencies, and karma built up in the past. Then each moment in turn transmits this storage to its successors, along with its own unique contribution. And thus the whole stream of experience has a unity and coherence. In one life we can identify ourselves as the same person from birth to death. But this can be done not because there's a permanent ego entity, but because there is a causal continuity, a transmission of experience going on at every moment. In the same way, at death, the body falls away and memory is blotted out. But the mental process, the stream of consciousness, continues on with the support of a new physical body. Character, experience, the tendencies, karma, these pass on through the flow of mind from one life to another. And now we come to the last topic, a very important topic. And this is the place of the teaching on the three characteristics in the Buddha's path to liberation. For the Buddha teaches only dukkha and the way to the end of dukkha. So all of his teachings in some way fit into his path to liberation. Now the Buddha holds that the way to deliverance, the way to the end of dukkha, lies through understanding the real nature of our existence. We remain tied to dukkha, to the round of becoming, to suffering, because of our craving, our clinging and attachments. The clinging and attachments continue to operate because our minds are covered over by ignorance and deluded by false conceptions, by the perversion. We cling to the body and mind because we see them as permanent, pleasurable, and as self. We interpret them as mine, but I truly am myself. From these erroneous notions, all sorts of defilements arise. Greed arises as the drive to acquisition. We want to grab hold of more pleasure, more power, higher status. We want to expand the territory of our supposed self, to appropriate things and make them mine. We want to go on becoming in the future, to preserve our individuality, to become immortal. This deluded idea of self also gives birth to anger and hatred towards what opposes ourself. It causes the arising of selfishness, jealousy, pride, vanity, competitiveness, the lust for power, and so forth. All arise out of the notion of selfhood. At the deepest level, the ideas of permanence, pleasure, and selfhood sustain the round of samsara. The wheel of birth and death turns because of our ignorance, because our minds are attracted by the lure of some kind of lasting happiness to be found within the world, or by the quest to find some identity for our self-concept. We run from one experience to another, from one life to another, seeking pleasure, seeking security, seeking confirmation of our sense of selfhood. But this is somewhat like a donkey hitched to a cart, chasing a carrot the driver has dangling in front of him. The donkey pursues the carrot with all of its might, but no matter how fast it runs, it never gets any closer to the carrot. But still it goes on and on, pulling the cart forward. Finally, when the donkey gets tired of chasing the carrot, it stops running. It sits down and relaxes. In the same way, when we get tired of running in pursuit of the objects of our desire, or of trying to substantiate our sense of selfhood, then we turn away and go to seek the way to liberation. And that way to liberation, the Buddha points out, lies precisely in the realization of the three marks of existence: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and selflessness. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. By turning the focus of our mental eye inward upon our own experience and looking at our experience with insight, we learn to see these three marks stamped on all the phenomena of body and mind, on all the five aggregates. And this leads to an end of identification. We stop identifying ourselves with the five aggregates. We see them as not mine, not I, not self. Whatever form and consciousness, whatever form there might be, whatever feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness there might be, we stop identifying with them. Then, by realizing the selflessness of all these phenomena, we turn away from them, we become detached, and with detachment there comes liberation. This is what the Buddha says in his second discourse on the mark of not self. He says that the meditator, the monk, sees the five aggregates: form, feelings, perceptions, the mental formations, and consciousness, as impermanent, subject to suffering, and is not self. And when he sees them thus, then he becomes disenchanted with them. He turns away from them. When he turns away from them, he becomes dispassionate towards them. And when he becomes dispassionate towards them, then he becomes liberated from them. And when he is liberated, there arises the knowledge of liberation. He knows destroyed is the round of rebirth. The holy life has been lived. Whatever had to be done has been done, and there is no further becoming to be unbegun. That is the end of dukkha, the goal of the teaching.